6 days before my daughter-in-law was scheduled to drive me to the notary's office to sign the paperwork transferring my house and my RRSPs into a family trust, I walked into Harriet's barbershop for my regular Thursday trim. I had been coming to Bluebell Cuts on the corner of Lakeview and Birch for 14 years. Harriet Osei had cut my hair the week I buried my husband, the morning I handed in my resignation letter from the school board, and every unremarkable Thursday in between. She knew the rhythm of my life, the way someone who stands behind you with scissors for 45 minutes every 2 weeks inevitably comes to know it. The particular slope of your shoulders when something is wrong, the way you look at yourself in the mirror when something is right. The bell above the door was still rattling when she came around the front counter, faster than I had ever seen her move, not smiling. Her face held the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for several days and had finally been given permission to set it down. She took my arm above the elbow and walked me straight past the 2 chairs, past the shelving unit of products I always ignored, into the narrow supply room at the back where she kept the extra towels and the coffee maker she had unplugged 3 years ago and never gotten rid of. She closed the door behind us and turned off the light. "Harriet," I said. She pressed one finger to her lips and pointed at the wall to our left. The shop next door had been vacant for 5 months. A former insurance broker's office, empty since the spring. I had walked past it on the way in and noticed, without really registering it, that the lights inside were on. I stood in the dark and listened. 2 voices. A man's voice first, measured and professional, the kind of voice that belongs to someone accustomed to explaining complicated things to people who are paying a great deal of money to be confused. Then a woman's voice, my daughter-in-law's voice, crisp and precise, the way she always sounded when she was certain she was the smartest person in the room, which was most of the time. She said, "She still doesn't know the trustee compensation structure. Keep it that way until she's signed. Once the trust document is executed, you have discretionary authority over distributions." She'd need to go to court to challenge a single withdrawal, and at her age, with everything we've documented, we can make that process extraordinarily difficult. I pressed my back against the shelving unit and stopped breathing. The man's voice, and I knew it immediately. It was the estate planner my son had introduced me to 7 months ago, said, "The capacity assessment is set for the 18th. Dr. Arsenault has reviewed the summary I sent him. He's prepared to provide documentation of sufficient cognitive decline to support a competency review if one is ever initiated. My daughter-in-law said it needs to be initiated by February if necessary. Brendan takes the position in Vancouver in March. We need clear access to those accounts before the move." A pause. "Then the property alone is assessed at $420,000. The RRSPs are sitting at just under $380,000. Between that and what Brendan inherited from his father's life insurance." Another pause. "We could actually leave. Do you understand what I'm saying? Leave and not come back." The man said he understood precisely. A chair moved. Footsteps. A door. Harriet turned the light back on. Her eyes were full and her hands were steadier than mine. She said, "They were there last Tuesday as well. Same conversation almost exactly. I kept picking up my phone to call you and putting it back down. I didn't know if I was wrong about what I was hearing." I looked at her for a moment. "You weren't wrong," I said. "I picked up my coat from where I had laid it over a shelf without noticing and walked back through the shop and out the front door into the October cold. My car was parked 2 spots down. I sat in it for a long time with the engine off. My son Brendan, 43 years old. The boy I had driven through a snowstorm to get to his university registration because he had missed the bus. The boy who had sat beside me for 3 days in the ICU when his father's heart failed, who had held my hand in the car on the way home from the hospital and not let go until we pulled into the driveway. The boy I had lent money to without asking for it back, not once, but twice, because I had not wanted him to feel the particular shame of meeting his mother when he was already a grown man. And my daughter-in-law, who called me by my first name because I had asked her to, who sent me a card every February on my wedding anniversary, not my birthday, my anniversary, because she had remembered that it was the harder day, who I had believed, genuinely believed, was good for him. And Dr. Arsenault, a man I had not yet met, who had already reviewed a summary of my mental health. I did not cry. I had done a great deal of crying in the 2.5 years since Gordon died, through the grief and the sleeplessness and the long Sunday mornings that had no shape without him. I had used up something in that car, and what remained was quiet and cold and entirely focused. I drove home. The house was the one Gordon and I had bought in 1991, a century-old red brick on a street lined with sugar maples in Guelph, Ontario. We had raised Brendan in that house. Gordon had built the back deck the summer Brendan turned 8. He had died in the bedroom upstairs 2.5 years ago, and I had not considered leaving for a single morning since. The house was not an asset to me. It was the record of a life I had loved deeply and was still, in my own way, in the middle of. $420,000 in property, $380,000 in RRSPs that Gordon and I had built together over 36 years of working and saving and choosing the sensible thing over the easy thing, his life insurance, everything. We could actually leave, she had said. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the maple in the backyard, the one Gordon had planted the spring we moved in because he said every house that intended to last needed a tree with ambition. Then I picked up my phone and called my friend Paulette. Paulette Charbonneau had been my closest friend for 27 years. We had met on the first day of a professional development workshop for curriculum coordinators in 1997, bonded immediately over our shared contempt for the facilitator, and been inseparable since. She had sat beside me at Gordon's funeral and spoken at it without notes because she had known him almost as long as I had. She answered before the second ring and listened without a word until I finished. Then she said, "You need to call Janet Ford," until I finished. Then she said, "You need to call Janet Ford." Janet Ford had handled Gordon's estate. She was in her late 50s, blunt in the way of someone who had decided years ago that directness was kinder than tact, and she had spent 15 years in elder law before moving to a general practice in Guelph. If anyone would understand what I had just described, it was Janet. I called her office and told the assistant it was urgent. Janet called back within the hour. I told her everything. The barber shop, the wall, the voices, the names, the trustee compensation structure my son had never mentioned, the capacity assessment scheduled for the 18th, doctor to the assessment scheduled for the 18th, Arsenault and his pre-prepared summary. The line was quiet for a moment after I finished. Janet said, "Do not sign anything next week. Do not let Brendan know you've heard anything. Come to my office tomorrow morning." I slept in Gordon's armchair in the living room that night because I could not make myself go upstairs. The house felt altered. Not dangerous exactly, more like a place that had been measured from the outside by someone calculating its dimensions. I thought about the past 7 months, about the conversation Brendan had with me in April at the kitchen table, the one where he had set a folder between us and spoken very gently about the importance of protecting what his father and I had built. He had brought tea. He had been patient and careful and so earnest that I had felt sitting across from him a rush of something close to gratitude. He had said, "Mum, I just don't want anything to happen to everything you and Dad worked for." I had believed him, completely, without hesitation. I thought about my daughter-in-law standing slightly behind him the way she always did in those conversations, her hand at the small of his back, the way her eyes moved through rooms when she thought no one was watching. And I thought about my son, about whether he was a man who had been led somewhere or a man who had chosen to go. I sat in Gordon's chair until 3 in the morning and could not decide. and I discovered in that stillness that the not knowing mattered to me more than almost anything else. Janet Ford's office was on the third floor of a building on Wyndham Street, above a bookshop I had been going to since Brendan was in primary school. She met me at the door with coffee and closed the blinds before we sat down. I passed her the folder of documents the estate planner had given me the previous month. She read them the way she read everything, slowly, twice, with a pencil. "This compensation structure," she said, setting it down and tapping a paragraph near the back. "If you sign next week, the trustee takes 1.8% of the trust assets annually as an administrative fee, plus an hourly advisory rate for any transaction above $15,000. On assets of this size, that's somewhere in the range of $14,000 to $16,000 a year in fees, before a single dollar is distributed to you." She looked up. "Did he explain this to you?" "No." "Did Brendan?" "No." She set the folder aside. "Tell me about Dr. Arsenault." I did. She made notes on a yellow legal pad without reacting. "Have you noticed anything yourself?" she said carefully. "Over the past several months, any changes that concerned you?" I thought about it honestly. There had been a few things. A pharmacy pickup I had forgotten in May. An afternoon in June when I had stood in the Canadian Tire parking lot for 10 minutes, trying to remember where I had parked, which had frightened me more than I had admitted to anyone. Small things. Things I had mentioned to Brendan because he had asked how I was managing. Janet looked at her notepad. Who knew about those incidents? Brendan. And I mentioned the parking lot to the estate planner at our meeting in July when he asked how I was doing. She set her pencil down. "Someone has been building a record. Not to protect you." She stood and went to her bookshelf. She found the volume she wanted without searching for it. "Fraudulent misrepresentation in an estate planning context constitutes financial elder abuse under the Criminal Code of Canada. If a physician fabricates or materially misrepresents a competency assessment, that's a separate matter for the College of Physicians and Surgeons. If the trustee has structured fees in a manner designed to conceal them from the settlor, that is a breach of fiduciary duty." She closed the book. "We can pursue this. But I need more than what you overheard through a wall." I said, "What do you need?" She wrote a name on a piece of paper and passed it to me across the desk. "Terence Olubayo, former RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, 20 years. He's retired, and he's thorough, and he's very quiet." I took the paper. "What do I do about next week?" "Call Brendan tonight. Tell him you've had a rough day and you'd like to push the appointment by a week. Give nothing else away." I drove home through downtown Guelph, past the library where Gordon had gone every Saturday morning to read the newspapers in the periodical room because he had always preferred reading them on paper. Past the school where I had worked for 22 years. Past all the ordinary places that had made up an ordinary life. I had been very glad to have. I called Brendan at 5 o'clock. He picked up immediately. His voice was warm. It was always warm. That was the thing I kept returning to. He said, "Mum, hi. Everything okay?" I told him I had a tension headache and thought I might need to push the appointment. He said, of course, no rush, take care of yourself, and asked if I needed anything. His voice held exactly the right amount of gentle concern. I listened for something underneath it the entire time and could not be certain what I heard. He said, "I love you, Mum." I said, "I love you too." I sat with the phone in my lap after we hung up and tried to understand how two completely contradictory things could both be true at the same time. Terence Olubayo arrived at my house the following morning carrying a canvas briefcase and wearing a jacket that made him look more like a retired geography teacher than a man who had spent 2 decades investigating financial fraud. He was 68, soft-spoken, and had the quality that very experienced investigators sometimes have of being completely still in a way that makes you want to say true things. I told him everything from the beginning. He listened without expression and took notes on a small spiral pad. When I finished, He asked to see the full folder of documents. I gave them to him. He said, "I'll need the estate planner's full name and license number, your daughter-in-law's full name, Brendan's employer, and Dr. Arsenault's full name and practice address." I had most of it. He said he could find the rest. At my front door, he paused and said, "One question. Your son. Do you believe he understands the full scope of what the estate planner and the doctor were planning? Or do you think he believed this was a legitimate arrangement?" I thought about April, the folder on the kitchen table, the tea, the way Brendan had looked at me when he said he didn't want anything to happen to what Gordon and I had built. The look had been real. I had known my son's face for 43 years. I said, "I don't know. That's the question I need answered most." Terence nodded slowly. "Then that's the right question to be asking." Paulette came over that evening and we sat at the kitchen table and went through 7 months of documents the estate planner had sent me. We laid them in order: the initial meeting summary from March, the draft trust outline in May, the revised management agreement in August, the appointment confirmation for the notary, 8 months of careful sequential construction, each document slightly more formal than the last, each one arriving just when the previous one had become familiar enough to stop feeling alarming. Paulette said, "He knew you were grieving, he knew you were alone, he walked you here one step at a time." At 9:20, my phone buzzed. A text from Terence: "Found several things. Can you have your lawyer there tomorrow at noon?" Janet arrived at 11:50. Terence arrived at noon precisely. He set his briefcase on the kitchen table, opened it, and placed 3 folders side by side. "I'll start with the estate planner," he said. The man had a history in Ontario. A client in Kingston, 71 years old, who had lost over $190,000 in undisclosed trustee fees between 2020 and 2020 before her niece discovered the management agreement and hired a lawyer. A settlement, sealed. A client in Hamilton, 68 years old, same structural pattern. A complaint filed with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario in 2023 that remained technically open. He has done this before, Terence said, to women who have recently lost their husbands and who have adult children presenting as concerned advocates. Janet leaned forward over the first folder. "The compensation structure he gave you mirrors the Kingston arrangement nearly identically." The second folder was my daughter-in-law. Before she married Brendan, she had worked as a legal assistant at an estate planning firm in Ottawa from 2014 to 2018. Terence had spoken, carefully and off the record, to someone who had worked there at the same time. My daughter-in-law had left under circumstances described as a quiet parting related to irregularities in client documentation. Nothing was prosecuted, nothing was on record. But she knew precisely how trust documents were built. She knew which clauses transferred authority and which paragraphs concealed fees from settlers who were not reading closely enough. I looked at the second folder for a long time without speaking. The third folder was the worst. Dr. Arsenault was not a specialist in geriatric psychiatry or neurology. He held a general practice license in Ontario and had completed a continuing education module in cognitive assessment 18 months ago. "He is not," Terence said, choosing his words carefully, "the kind of physician you call when you genuinely want to understand someone's cognitive health. He is the kind of physician you call when you need a document." He had been retained as a consultant in 2 other trust arrangements in the previous 3 years, both involving women over 65, both involving the same trustee compensation structure. One of those women was currently in a memory care facility outside of Ottawa. Her property had been sold the previous spring. Janet looked at me across the table. I said, "Was Brendan involved in what happened in Ottawa?" Terence shook his head. "He and your daughter-in-law married in 2019. As far as I can establish, your son believed this was a legitimate estate planning process. She introduced him to the estate planner. She proposed the trust structure. She framed it to Brendan as protecting you. I sat with that for a long moment. Janet said, "Is there anything placing Brendan in knowing participation in the fraud?" Terence said, "He signed one preliminary document as a co-trustee designate. He may face questions, but the deliberate intent appears to originate with your daughter-in-law and the estate planner," Janet said. "So, what do you want to do?" I had been thinking about it since the night I sat in Gordon's chair. I had thought about calling Brendan privately first, about simply refusing to sign, and letting the whole thing dissolve without ever saying the word fraud, in a room where people could hear it. I had thought about all the ways to handle this that allowed everyone to walk away without looking directly at what had been built around my grief. But I thought about the woman outside Ottawa, her house sold, her money gone, her children presumably satisfied. I thought about Kingston. I thought about whoever came next if nothing was done. I said, "I want to reschedule the notary appointment for Saturday afternoon, here at the house. Tell Brendan and my daughter-in-law and the estate planner that I've decided I'm ready, that I want to get it finalized." Janet looked at me carefully. And then I want to finish it," I said. Saturday I spent the morning making the house very clean. I made Gordon's butter tart squares, the ones he had made every Thanksgiving, because our son had refused to eat pie until he was 12 and Gordon had found an alternative, and then kept making them long after Brendan had come around on pie. Because some things become tradition, not because they're necessary, but because they are yours. I sat at Gordon's desk in the study and looked at his photograph and told him what I was going to do. I told him I was frightened. I told him the frightened part did not change anything. Paulette arrived at 1 o'clock to sit in the living room and be present. My former colleague, Dwight Amara, who had been the assistant superintendent when I was with the school board and who I trusted entirely, arrived at 1:30. Janet was already there with a colleague from her office. Terence sat in the corner with his briefcase on his knee. At 2:50, I heard a car in the driveway. I stood at the kitchen window and watched Brendan and my daughter-in-law come up the front walk. Brendan was carrying his leather folio. My daughter-in-law was wearing the grey blazer she wore to anything she considered important. The estate planner's car pulled in behind them. I opened the front door and I smiled. Brendan hugged me. He smelled like the same soap he had used since university, the bar kind, unscented, because he had always had sensitive skin, and I had bought him the first one, and he had simply never changed. He said, "You look well, Mum. How's the head?" "Much better," I said. "Come in." I made Gordon's tart squares. My daughter-in-law hugged me and said the house smelled wonderful and called me by my first name the way she always did. The estate planner shook my hand and smiled, the smile of a man who expects the next hour to require very little of him. I led them into the dining room where the table was set and the documents were laid out. Janet and Paulette and Dwight were already seated along the far side. The estate planner hesitated for only a moment at the number of people in the room, then composed himself. He said, "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting all of your guests." "No," I said, "you haven't." I sat at the head of the table. Brendan sat to my left. My daughter-in-law sat beside him. The estate planner took the chair directly across from me. He opened his briefcase with the smooth efficiency of someone who does this often. "Before we proceed," he said, "I'd like to walk through the final document one more time to make sure everyone is comfortable." I said, "I'd like to say something first." "Of course," he said. I looked at my son. Brendan was watching me with the careful, patient expression he always used when he thought I was about to need managing. I knew that expression. I had watched it develop over the past 2.5 years, like a habit he had not realized he was forming. "Before your father died," I said, "he asked me to promise him one thing. He said, 'Joanna, you have spent your entire life taking care of other people. Promise me you'll take care of what we built together.'" Brendan's expression softened. My daughter-in-law looked at the table. "I kept that promise," I said. "This week." Silence. I nodded to Terence. He placed the 3 folders on the table. I looked at the estate planner. "3 weeks ago, you gave me a trust document with a 1.8% annual trustee compensation fee and an hourly advisory rate for transactions above $15,000. You did not mention this to my son because he does not know it is there. Brendan looked at the estate planner. What does she mean? The estate planner said. I think there may be some confusion about the fee structure. If we could review the document together, Janet said, clearly. The fee structure is on page 9, section 5, in a paragraph embedded within standard administrative boilerplate. This is the identical structure used in an arrangement in Kingston, Ontario, that resulted in a settled FSAAHA complaint against this individual in 2022. Brendan stared at him. I opened the first folder and turned it to face my son. His face went very still. My daughter-in-law's hands were flat on the table. I want to tell you about Ottawa, I said, and I looked at my daughter-in-law directly for the first time since they had arrived. Her expression was composed in the deliberate way of someone who had anticipated this possibility and decided that stillness was her best defense. Before you and Brendan were married, I said, you worked as a legal assistant at an estate planning firm in Ottawa. You left after questions were raised about irregularities in client documentation. You know precisely how trust documents are constructed, which provisions transfer authority, and which language buries fees that a grieving widow reading quickly would not catch. She said, that is a complete mischaracterization of why I left that firm. Dwight placed a printed document on the table in front of Brendan. I kept my eyes on her. You introduced my son to this man. You proposed the trust structure. You framed it to Brendan as protecting me, because Brendan loves me and would do anything he believed was protecting me. You used that. She said, I have only ever tried to help this family. Brendan was looking at the document in front of him. I could not see his face. And then there is Dr. Arsenault, I said. The estate planner stood. I don't think this conversation needs to continue. Janet said, please sit down. 2 officers from the Guelph Police Service Financial Crimes Unit are currently outside this house. They have been briefed. If you leave this room before I make a call, you will make their job considerably easier. He sat. Dr. Arsenault, I said, holds a general practice license in Ontario. He completed a continuing education module in cognitive assessment 18 months ago. He was scheduled to assess me on the 18th after I signed these documents. The assessment was not intended to protect me. It was intended to provide a retrospective framework to challenge my capacity to revoke the trust if I ever attempted to do so. Brendan said, very quietly, Mum. I looked at my son. His face was pale. He was looking at the folder in front of him, and not at me, and not at his wife. He said, I didn't know about the doctor. I know, I said. My daughter-in-law said, Brendan. He put his hand up without looking at her. 2 women, I said to the room, have already lost everything to this. A woman in Kingston lost over $190,000. A woman outside Ottawa had her home sold last year and is currently in a memory care facility being paid for with what remained of her savings. Neither of them did anything wrong. They trusted the people who were supposed to love them. I looked around the table. I want to be clear about something. I am not confused. I am not in decline. I am 64 years old. I worked for the school board for 22 years. I raised a good son and I buried a good husband, and I have managed every year since then on my own with full clarity. No one in this room or anywhere else has the authority to decide otherwise. Janet stood. She referred the estate planner to the FSRA and the Ontario Securities Commission. She named Dr. Arsenault as a separate referral to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. She looked at my daughter-in-law and said that the question of her involvement was under active review. The officers came to the door. The estate planner left without speaking. He looked, in the end, very small. The way people look when they have been operating behind a structure that has just been removed all at once. My daughter-in-law looked at Brendan. Her composure was gone now. She looked frightened in the specific way of someone whose mask has been taken faster than they planned for. She said, "I was doing this for us, for our future. You know what we owe. You know I never planned to hurt her." Brendan did not respond. She picked up her bag and walked past me without looking at me and let herself out the front door. The room was quiet for a long time after the cars left the driveway. Dwight poured water. Paulette put her hand on my shoulder and left it there. Janet gathered her documents with the brisk efficiency I had always found quietly comforting. Brendan was still sitting at the table. He had not moved. His folio sat in front of him unopened, the one he had carried up the front walk, believing this afternoon would end differently. He said, "Mum, I'm sorry." I sat down beside him. He said, "When she told me you were forgetting things, when she said he was one of the best estate planners in the province, when she brought me the paperwork and said this was what responsible children did." He stopped. "I wanted to protect you. I genuinely believed that's what I was doing." He put his hands over his face. "I treated you like the decision had already been made, like you were already someone who needed things arranged around her instead of with her. And you weren't. You never were." "No," I said. "I wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I need you to know," he said, "that if I had known what was actually in those documents, what he had done before, what she had been planning—" He stopped again. "I wouldn't have. Not for anything." I looked at my son, 43 years old, his father's hands and his father's jaw, and the same quality his father had always had of being completely unable to hide what he felt. Gordon had loved that about him. So had I. "I know," I said. "I believe you." He looked up. "But Brendan," I said, "you let someone tell you I was slipping. You let someone take the small, hard moments of my grief and call them evidence. You stopped asking me directly what I needed and started making arrangements instead. And somewhere in there, you had already decided I had become someone who needed looking after by people who knew better." He didn't argue. He looked at the table. "That's what we need to talk about," I said. "Not today, but soon." He nodded. In the weeks that followed, the quiet came back to the house on the street with the sugar maples, but it was a different quiet than the one I had been living in since Gordon died. Less hollow, more inhabited. Harriet called every few days. Paulette was Paulette, which is to say she was everywhere and constant, and occasionally brought soup without being asked, which is the highest form of friendship I know. Dwight came for dinner on the second Friday of every month. The estate planner surrendered his registration to the FSSAI in December pending the investigation. The Ontario Securities Commission opened a separate file. Criminal charges were laid in January. The woman from Kingston had a lawyer now, one Janet had referred. 3 other women came forward through the investigation, none of them people I had known. All of them women who'd been alone and had trusted the wrong person at a moment when their defenses were low and their grief was loud. Whatever the courts eventually decided, that part felt like enough. Dr. Bird, Arsenault's license was suspended in November, pending a full review by the college. He said nothing through his lawyer. My daughter-in-law moved out of the house she and Brendan had been renting in October. She did not dispute the separation. I learned this from Brendan in careful, short phone calls that were growing slightly less short as November became December. I requested a voluntary cognitive assessment in November, conducted over 2 days at the Guelph General Neurology Department by a physician I found entirely on my own. Her report was unambiguous, no evidence of cognitive impairment, memory, processing speed, and executive function all within the high normal range for my age group. She noted, with what I interpreted as mild amusement, that I had identified an error in her sentence structure during the verbal component of the assessment, and that very few of her patients did that. I had the report framed and hung it in the study next to Gordon's photograph. Not entirely seriously, but not entirely as a joke either. On the days when grief and age and solitude made me wonder about myself, I wanted a reminder that wondering was not the same thing as declining. Brendan called on Boxing Day and asked if he could come. He arrived with a tin of Gordon's favourite shortbread from the bakery downtown, which he had never done before, and spent the afternoon sitting across from me at the kitchen table while I taught him how to make the butter tart squares from memory. Because he had asked me to write down the recipe 3 times over the years, and I had never gotten around to it, and I decided that Boxing Day was the right time to stop putting it off. We ate at the table where 6 weeks earlier I had laid out 3 folders and ended several things at once. After dinner he sat with his hands around his coffee mug in the way his father always had and said, "I've been talking to someone, a therapist. She's been helping me understand some things." He looked at his hands. "She asked me when I stopped trusting you to be okay, and I couldn't answer her. And then I realized I thought I was protecting you, but I was actually just afraid. After Dad died, I needed something to do, and when she gave me something to do, I didn't ask nearly enough questions about whether it was actually what you needed. I listened." He said, "That's on me. Not on her, not on grief, not on you." I thought about that for a while. I said, "Your father was never afraid to tell me when I had gotten something wrong. I always loved him most for that. I'd like us to be able to do that for each other." Brendan looked at his coffee. "Yeah," he said. "Me too. On the last Sunday of December, I drove to the cemetery where Gordon is buried, on the east edge of the city where the land opens up past the last subdivisions. The maples were bare. The light was the particular thin grey that southern Ontario does in winter, flat and patient. The place was quiet, in the way that outdoor places are quiet when the year is almost finished. I sat with him and told him all of it: the barber shop, the wall, the folders, the officers at the door. I told him Brendan was doing the work of becoming someone better. I told him I was all right. I told him the house was still ours. I had decided that in Gordon's chair the night everything tilted sideways, and I had not changed my mind since. I drove home through Guelph, past the library and the school, and over the river bridge, and I pulled into the driveway under the sugar maple, that is older now than Brendan was when we planted it, and I went inside and made tea and sat in the kitchen in the quiet, which was mine. If you stayed through all of that, I want to ask you something honestly, because I have been sitting with it since the afternoon I laid 3 folders on my own dining room table and watched the truth land on my son's face. The hardest part was not the estate planner or his documents, or the doctor who had pre-written a file about my mind. The hardest part was Brendan, not what he did, what he had already decided about me, quietly and without realizing it, long before anyone arrived with paperwork. He had watched me grieve and pulled inward the way I always do when things are hard, and he had looked at my closed door and decided it meant I was diminished. That was his mistake, but I had helped make the space for it. After Gordon died, I chose competence over closeness, because competence was the thing I had always known how to perform. I did not let my son help me with the small daily things that would have kept us near each other. I kept the door shut because keeping the door shut had always felt safer than letting anyone see how much I was struggling. If there is anything worth taking from what happened to me, it is this: the people who look for openings in grief and age and solitude, they need one to start. Sometimes that opening comes from someone with a briefcase and plan, but sometimes it begins much earlier and much closer to home, when a mother and a child stop talking honestly to each other and leave a space that someone else eventually fills. Don't let the door stay closed. Whatever it costs to keep it open is less than what tends to come through when the wrong person finds it standing that way. Thank you for walking through this with me. If any part of this felt familiar, if you have ever sat in a room with someone you love and realized you had not been seeing them clearly, I would be grateful if you'd share that in the comments. I read everyone, and if you're not subscribed yet, I hope you'll stay. I have more to tell.